Amara H. Pérez, Sisters in Action for Power Between Radical Theory and Community Praxis Reflections on Organizing and the Nonprofit Industrial Complex in 1999. After growing tensions between our organization, Sisters in Portland Impacting Real Issues Together, and our parent organization, the Center for Third World Organizing, Spirit was officially shut down. This suspension of operation would have left the local community we had been organizing for almost 4 years without the capacity to conduct girl-driven campaigns around critical policy issues such as education, transportation, and safety. This abrupt split left us with the decision to either concede to the closure or spin off and rebuild the organization as an independent nonprofit structure. Many factors contributed to that unexpected and demoralizing split. In hindsight, however, I have come to understand those tensions more as symptomatic of the general state of the movement than as specific conditions of our experience. The initial values, intentions, and politics of an organization can be sound, radical, and inspiring, but it can also be clear from the outset that social change efforts can be susceptible to bad practices. While the history of what has now become Sisters in Action for Power begins with a bitter account of the way we were closed, it is more a thoughtful reflection of the exhaustive steps taken to rebuild the organization and a critical examination of a movement's struggle to align politics and values to organizational infrastructure, practice, and vision. The nature of nonprofit structures, the power and influence of foundation funding, and the relationship of both to social change organizations present complex and challenging questions for the movement. At the time of our shutdown, Spirit was just over 3 years old. I had been working as an organizer almost since its inception and had become the director 6 months earlier. Our small staff was young and relatively new to community organizing. Collectively, the leadership had virtually no experience in grant writing, strategic planning, or conducting the tasks needed to build the infrastructure of a nonprofit. However, our membership, leaders, and the board of directors were committed to our mission of developing the leadership, critical analysis, and community organizing skills of low-income girls and girls of color ages 10 through 18 in Portland, Oregon. As we worked to do what we thought would ensure a healthy and stable organization, most of the advice we received was about fundraising, administrative development, and infrastructure. First, there was fundraising. We spent a great deal of time dedicated to writing and rewriting letters of interest, proposals, and reports. We secured visits from out-of-town program officers and planned for local site visits. Often applying for grants from foundations resulted in our taking on additional work as required by guidelines that were not always reflective of our own internal priorities. The decision to pursue funding despite the less-than-perfect match was a necessary means of staying open to continue our work. Unfortunately, it also required us to overextend ourselves to do both the work we had envisioned and the work we had assumed now as grantees. The foundation dance has always been complex. As organizations with significant budgets and paid staff, foundations are commonly sought after by nonprofits as a primary funding source. It is not unusual that we become dependent on grants to fund our work and pay our leadership, and for most of us, the money is difficult to raise, unpredictable, and inconsistent. Nonetheless, private foundations fund many community groups across the country doing amazing work. And some foundations do spend a great deal of time thinking about how to best support social justice work by funding direct action, grassroots leadership development, or providing travel money to take leaders to activist gatherings like the World Social Forums. And there are many program officers who are undoubtedly committed to social justice. Many have come from organizing backgrounds and ensure that some of the radical work we are doing is actually funded. We build relationships with foundations and the leadership within them, turning to them in times of need for support and resources that can often be decisive to the survival of an organization. For example, without foundation support at the time of our split, we might never have had the opportunity to continue and deepen our organizing efforts in Portland. Like many other groups, Sisters in Action for Power struggles to navigate through these complexities and contradictions. But the reality is foundations are ultimately interested in the packaging and production of success stories, measurable outcomes, and the use of infrastructure and capacity building systems. As nonprofit organizations that rely on foundation money, we must embrace and engage in the organizing market. This resembles a business model in that the consumers are foundations to which organizations offer to sell their political work for a grant. The products sold include the organizing accomplishments, models, and successes that one can put on display to prove competency and legitimacy. In the movement market, organizations competing for limited funding are, most commonly, similar groups doing similar work across the country. Not only does the movement market encourage organizations to focus solely on building and funding their own work, it can create uncomfortable and competitive relationships between groups most alike, chipping away at any semblance of a movement-building culture. Over time, funding trends actually come to influence our work, priorities, and direction as we struggle to remain competitive and funded in the movement market. For many activists, this has shifted the focus from strategies for radical change to charts and tables that demonstrate how successfully the work has satisfied foundation-determined benchmarks. Ironically, it is also foundations that most often bring similar social justice groups together from all over the country. And we spend this rare, precious time together walking through the foundation's agendas, meeting their priorities, and contributing to the publications, manuals, and essays they distribute on the field of organizing. Meanwhile, the occasions we do come together to discuss our own needs, based on our own agendas, and without the gaze of funders, are few and far between. In addition to the power and influence of foundation funding, the nonprofit model itself has contributed to the co-optation of our work and institutionalized a structure that has normalized a corporate culture for the way our work is ultimately carried out. In the initial phase of our efforts to sustain spirit as Sisters in Action for Power, we were overwhelmed with the administrative steps required to become independent. We had to learn to set up accounting programs, a process for paying bills and spending money, legal requirements, insurance, liability, personnel policies, and payroll. We were informed of the need to incorporate as soon as possible and secure our own 501. A long list of administrative steps and documents were required, including hundreds of pages of legal credentials, bylaws, articles of incorporation, and other forms and contracts. We registered as a nonprofit organization in a dozen state, city, and county offices. For purposes of staffing, we were expected to produce job descriptions, job announcements, a formal hiring process, and official methods of supervision. And of course, we needed letterhead, business cards, a fax machine, copier, printer, computers, email accounts, and information packets promoting our accomplishments and successes. In the end, the ongoing work to maintain and prospect foundation money, combined with administrative obligations and developing infrastructure, was more taxing and exhausting than confronting any institution to fight for a policy change. While working to build this complex infrastructure, we were simultaneously running our issue campaign to reduce bus fares for students traveling to and ETEGPLY BUEND from school. We continued to conduct weekly youth nights, leadership meetings, and campaign planning sessions, always engaging longtime members in as much of the organizational development work as possible. But it remained a significant challenge to balance the organizing work, foundation fundraising, and the work of building a nonprofit. This balance required us to move back and forth between two worlds and between two areas of work demanding two very different sets of skills. It was always clear which of the two drained us more and seemed more distant from the very purpose for which we had all come into organizing, leaving us to question if the most effective and strategic grassroots organizing can take place in a 501 model. After 2 difficult years of stabilizing Sisters in Action for Power, we had the essential elements of a nonprofit organization in place. Moving out of crisis, we settled into our work. Our long 4-year fight finally resulted in a major campaign victory, the creation of a new student bus pass, half of the original fare and available to over 200,000 students in Portland's Tri-County area. Our youth leadership model had evolved into a well-structured, successful, and creative program designed to train and support girls in envisioning, planning, and carrying out strategic actions to make social change. Sisters in Action for Power began to receive national recognition, and soon we were encouraged by foundations and supporters to enlarge the scope of our activities, set up chapters, double our membership base, and hire more staff. It was assumed that we could simply take our work and expand it without compromising our project's integrity or our own political goals. It was always a strange conversation to explain why we resisted the pressure to expand. Raising our budget each year was already quite difficult with only 3 paid staff members. While tempted by the allure of larger is better, we were daunted by the prospect of needing to raise even more money to function. In addition, inherent to our organizing and leadership development model was the practice of small, deep, and intensive skill building, consciousness raising, and strategizing. More of everything would have taken away from what we knew worked. Most social justice allies and supporters encouraged us to do exactly what has become standard practice in building community-based organizations. And in many ways, we moved in the very direction that emphasized building an individual organization over relating to a larger movement or shared analysis, securing 501 status without questioning issues of sustainability or strategy, pursuing foundation grants to fund staff and program work with little discussion of other options like volunteer staff, and spotlighting the accomplishments of one's organizing work to seize any opportunity to expand strategic or not. Most of our initial work after the split with our parent organization moved us further from social change efforts and toward nonprofit building work. We were studied the political and social truth about the discovery of America. We pled this critical discussion with several weeks of self-defense designed to examine how the control of mind, body, and spirit has been used by this system historically and today. Even after finishing the curriculum, we maintain these critical discussions with members and staff. We use the pillars of colonization to examine national trends, dominant culture, and the current state of the mind and body in our society. We connected the past to the present, seeking edge to inform our own tactics and strategies for change. An essential project, the colonialism curriculum, was a genuine attempt to revisit the political nature of our work as it related to a larger movement and a larger legacy of struggle. There was no initial sense of where it would take us, or what would ultimately and concretely be derived from it all. But our ability to operate as a social justice group in a nonprofit, foundation-funded organization was made possible by the time we dedicated to collective reflection, evaluation, and political discussion. The challenge, of course, is carving out the space and time with an already overextended workload. Often reflection and evaluation are not prioritized or seen as the real work. In addition, without elaborate DOS, mapped-out outcomes, or outside consultants to facilitate, this work is also difficult to fund. But in the end, it becomes work one undertakes because of its intrinsic value and merit. It is what one points to when asked about internal PRI, ORIDIs, and behind-the-scenes work that are often made invisible by the more concrete, measurable tasks. In fact, people were more interested in getting a copy of the colonialism curriculum than in any aspect of the front or back-end process that insulated and cultivated the very activities which made up the curriculum. Our current campaign addresses local school closures, high-stakes testing, and sanctions under the federal law known as the No Child Left Behind Act. Beyond the deceitful name itself, NCLB promises education equity, freedom of choice, accountability, bridging the achievement gap, and high-quality teachers. In reality, NCLB discredits, defunds, and dismantles public education and money from grassroots sources to reduce dependency on foundations. The work is slow and painstaking, but essential to sustaining our work over the long run. These are some steps that can be taken to transform internal cultures and practices in ways that are more congruent with the objectives of radical change. In the last few years, we have received several calls from organizers seeking advice on splitting or spinning off from larger organizations. We share these same lessons as well as new ones we've learned in our ongoing navigation through the nonprofit model. But we also remind people that this is only one model for doing social justice work. There are other models that may be very different from our experiences, which respond to a specific set of objective conditions at a specific historical moment. For example, in many of these models, organizers do not get paid to do the work. When beginning to determine the direction and structure of the work to be carried out, be certain you want it to be housed in the non-profit world and be clear of what that will entail. At Sisters in Action for Power, it continues to be a work in progress every year, trying to name and address that which takes us away from the work and that which sustains us. Is it reasonable to operate in a 501 and still maintain a political edge and revolutionary commitment? This is what we're trying to do by using a political framework that a budget that does not deplete us to raise, by integrating grassroots fundraising throughout the organization, and by taking the time to assess and improve on our terms the work we do. As a young organizer, I was introduced to this work with the idea that it could be a career housed in a nonprofit structure and funded by foundations, and that these structures could sustain the movement. 10 years later, I think we need to re-examine the model, assess its sustainability, and determine its political direction. Foundation funding and nonprofit management not only exhausts us and potentially compromises our radical edge, it also has us persuaded that